Educated as an historian, Mindy Quigley has worked in project management roles with university research centers in the United States, Europe, Hong Kong, and China. More recently, she was project manager of the Anne Rolling Regenerative Neurology Clinic, a research clinic founded by the author J.K. Rowling. Her time as the coordinator of Pastoral Services Outreach Program at the Duke University Medical Center provided the inspiration for her first novel, A Murder in Mount Moriah. Her fiction has been recognized in several prestigious writing competitions, and she and her family moved to Blacksburg from Scotland last August. The title of her piece is The Best Dish, Mindy Quigley.
The best dish. One way or the other, I knew this would be our last meal together. I had laid the kitchen with all our best things, the green flowery tablecloth and the glass candlesticks my mama gave us for our wedding. The walls of our little house groaned against the January storm outside, but the place was built so snug and tight that the candle flames didn't so much as flicker, even as the wind howled. I looked across at my husband. He cut his food into large chunks using only his fork and rapidly shoveled the pieces into his mouth. "Are you enjoying your food?" I asked quietly. "If you can call it food." He grunted the words, not looking up from his plate. There was a brief silence. Even after 18 years of marriage, I still wasn't sure whether it was better to fill these silences or to let them be. To take either course was to place a bet. Heads, he'd win. Tails, I'd lose. "It's eggplant parmesan. I got the eggplant in the wine at the Save-A-Lot in Elkins." This was no mean feat, and he knew it. Our house stands in a little hollow by the side of the South Fork of the Potomac, near Judy Gap in West Virginia. A single-lane track branches off of Route 33, one of those little byways that you might well pass without even noticing. It runs along for a few miles, losing its shape as it goes, passing first the big Maggart farm, then our little place. By the time it ends in front of the Bickford's house, the track has almost entirely leaked out into the surrounding forest. There is nothing like a real town for miles and miles all around, just trees and slopes, creeks and hollows. Elkins is what passes for civilization out here, and getting there was always an ordeal. The previous day, I'd done the mile walk to the Bickfords, and then borrowed Willetta Bickford's old Ford F-150. The suspension was shot, and it rattled over the rutted-out track and then zigzagged through the forest for the hour that it took to get to Elkins. I rarely make the trip in winter. My husband doesn't like me to drive the car, so it's easier to make do with things from the cupboard or the deep freeze, and even if I had been allowed to drive, I couldn't have. My husband had taken the car that morning to drive our son, Clay, back to Glenville State for the new semester. We had seen less and less of Clay since he went away to school. Last summer, he stayed with a friend in Roanoke for the whole summer break. He'd be graduating at the end of June, and he talked sometimes about taking a job up in the oil fields in Alaska. I wondered how long it would be until even his annual Christmas visits would be stopped altogether. I'd be left alone with my husband, out here forever. My husband took hold of his glass of wine, his sinuous fingers curling into a fist around the stem. "You got a pantry full of potatoes and a freezer full of meat, and you take a goddamn 3-hour round trip to get a goddamn eggplant?" He spat the words at me. A tiny foam of spit formed in the corners of his mouth. I tried to make my face sweet, my body small. "It's our anniversary, 18 years. I kept my eyes cast down, chancing only the briefest glance at his face. He snorted, and his lower lip curled into a smile. "Yeah, I should have known you'd be trouble when I married you. Bad luck to get married on Friday the 13th. I smiled obediently, as if his words were meant as a joke instead of a threat, and filled his glass with the last of the wine. He didn't notice that I had hardly even touched my own glass. After we finished the meal, he settled in next to the wood burner and knocked back one of the other bottles of wine I brought home from Elkins. As I put away the dishes, he lumbered into the kitchen, tilting slightly to one side from the effects of the alcohol. He rummaged among the coats and the sweaters on the hooks next to the door, getting himself ready to go out to the barn and feed the pigs and finish up the evening chores. "Where's my coat?" he demanded. The big casserole dish I held slipped from my grasp and crashed heavily into the sink. It cracked into two almost perfect halves. My best dish broken into two. "I haven't quite finished sewing on the new zipper." I tried to keep my voice even. His eyes flashed like a marquee, advertising the malice behind them. He took a step toward me, but stumbled so much that he had to catch himself on the wall. Even a seasoned drinker like him was befuddled by having drunk 2 bottles of wine in less than an hour. I turned back toward the sink, gripping the edge of the porcelain and bracing myself for what might come next. I lowered my head and hunched my shoulders, trying to telescope my body into itself. Outside the window in front of me, the snow was being thrown down with such force that it was almost as if the sky wanted to do the flakes some injury. I heard him grunt and turn back toward the door. I glanced over my shoulder and saw him pull on an extra sweater and walk out, leaving the door wide open behind him. I ran across the kitchen to shut the door and lock it before all the warmth from the house was sucked into the frigid night. Next, I moved around the ground floor. I opened each window and pulled the heavy wooden storm shutters into place. They were secured from the inside with iron bars that slid between thick iron rings. Though roughly constructed, they had withstood many decades of fearsome weather. Finally, for good measure, I shoved heavy pieces of furniture in front of both doors. A 2-day blizzard was predicted, the worst of an already bitter winter. Within moments, I had the whole house locked up tight. Only the rhythmic whooshing noise from the wind outside was heard. I felt like I was in a submarine at the bottom of the ocean. I raced upstairs to the window of our bedroom. I left the shutters open in this one room so I could watch, and I was just in time. The blizzard had made the sky oddly bright outside, although the winter sun had gone down hours before. Illuminated in the powerful spotlight fixed to the wall of the low wooden barn, my husband struggled with the huge lock and chain I had placed across the door that afternoon. He rattled it once more and turned around to face our house. I could picture it from his perspective. He would see the dim light peeking around the edges of the shuttered windows, the white smoke from the chimney being thrown this way and that by the powerful winds, snow piling up in ever-increasing drifts in the small front yard. He made his way out of sight around to the other entrance of the barn. Although I could no longer see him, I knew that he would find that door locked too. Almost unconsciously, my hand went to the pocket of my housecoat, where I gripped the keys to both padlocks. These had been another purchase in Elkins. He came back into sight, moving quickly, in fact, almost running back toward our house. The unsteadiness seemed to be gone from his steps. When he reached the kitchen door, just below where I was standing, he disappeared from sight again. I could hear him banging at that door, the sound of his fists competing with the force of the storm outside. He screamed my name, his voice sounding thin and high as it was carried away by the wind. He circled the house, and I knew that he would try the front door next. I ran downstairs. Sure enough, almost in time with the gusts of wind, I could hear the blows of his body as he threw his whole weight against the door. My husband was a slight man, but strong. Strong enough to break 4 of a woman's ribs with a single punch. Strong enough to throw my lovely boy across the room as if he were nothing but a sack of garbage. Bracing myself against the dresser that I'd pushed in front of the door, I counted the times he threw himself against it, screaming for me to open up. 18 times. I wondered if he had counted too, or if it was just a coincidence. One blow of his body for each of the 18 years we had been married. Suddenly, it was quiet and still. I imagined him standing on the other side, bent over slightly and panting heavily, the way he sometimes did after his anger was spent. Although I couldn't see him, I knew what he would see when he turned away from the house. He wasn't a smart man, but he would be running through his options. He would first look back toward the locked barn, knowing that inside lay ladders, hammers, a crowbar, an axe, all sorts of things to use to break into the house. I had made a point of putting everything away the previous week. Then I closed my eyes and I imagined the light coming from our nearest neighbors, the Bickfords' house, shining like a beacon through the storm. I willed him to look toward the house, which stood partway up the mountain about a mile up the road. I prayed that he would walk toward it. He and Ed Bickford weren't particularly friendly, but he would know from experience that Ed would help him out. Even after all the times when Willetta had to take my son for a day or two because I was too bruised and broken to care for him, Ed never asked a single question of my husband. I went back upstairs to the darkened bedroom. I approached the window cautiously, as if I might find my husband's face looming there, as if he could magically levitate up to the second floor, smash the glass, and grab me by the throat. Whispering a silent prayer, I peered out. I had guessed right. I could see his receding form heading off down the track toward the Bickfords. Their house stood alone at the end of the track, surrounded on all sides by black forest. It was just how I had imagined it that morning when I had gone over to their house, letting myself in with the spare key Willetta Bickford had given me. They had left the day before. Willetta's husband was scheduled to have prostate surgery at the hospital in Charleston the following week, and they had decided to leave a few days early and stay with her sister in town to make sure they got out ahead of the storm. I'd fed their chickens and watered their houseplants. I had turned on the outside lights, which I knew were bright enough to be seen from our house, even on a stormy night. I shuttered and barred all their windows, locked their doors, and left. By now, my husband would be starting to shiver. His wet clothes would be pierced by each fresh gust of wind. It would take him at least 20 minutes to get to the Bickfords in this weather, another 20 to try to force his way into their house once he found it locked and barred. I had to pray that their house, too, would resist his attempts to get in. If he couldn't get in at their place, I knew he would come back. That would buy me 20 more minutes. I raced downstairs, grabbed the shovel that I had stowed in the hall closet, ran outside, and unlocked the car. When he got back, if he got back, he might have grown desperate. He didn't have keys with him. I had taken them from their usual hook by the back door so he wouldn't unconsciously grab them on his way out the door. But he might smash the car window with a rock and take shelter inside. It might give him just enough shelter to survive the freezing night. I opened the car door, and then I frantically began to fill the interior with snow. I shoveled and shoveled until the whole passenger cabin was packed solid. Carefully, I locked the door and forced it closed. When I was finished, I ran back inside and locked the door to the house. With shaking hands, I made myself a cup of tea. I brought it upstairs, taking the stairs one at a time, trying to soothe myself by walking slowly. How many times had I limped up these stairs, and how many times had he dragged me down them? I'd never counted them before, and I almost laughed when I discovered that there were 18 of them, one for each year. I sat down by the window to wait. I watched the minute hand drag around the clock as if it were moving through molasses. I rehearsed again what I would do in the morning. I would unlock everything, open everything, shovel the snow out of the car. I would call 911 and say that I'd gone to bed early, feeling sick, that I'd woken up to find him gone. When I couldn't find him around our house, I walked along the road, and there he was, frozen, blue, hard as granite. That I had no idea why he would have headed out in such bad weather. Everyone knew that sometimes he did strange things when he'd been drinking. Then I would call Clay, and I would tell him to come home, that he should finish school, and then he should come home and stay with me forever. More than an hour passed. I looked anxiously outside, but there was nothing. Only the big oak tree at the edge of the track, its bare branches reaching out to rake the sky like cold fingers. I began to despair. I had bet everything I had on this. Maybe he had found shelter at the Bickfords after all. Would he come home in the morning, thundering and cursing me, or would he wait a couple of days, letting me sweat and worry before giving me my punishment? There were so many thousands of ways to upset him. I seemed to stumble upon new ones without even trying. I set out each day seeking peace, but always found myself deep in trouble. Today was different. Today I had woken up looking for trouble. Just when I had given up all hope, he came into view. He was walking slowly, zombie-like, his body convulsing with shivers. As I had expected, he made his way over to the car. It was parked next to the barn, and the whole scene was lit by the spotlight on the barn wall. He paused when he saw what I had done and rested his hands on the trunk to steady himself. As I surveyed the scene, I realized with horror that the shovel I had used to fill the car was lying on the ground at the front of the car. It was almost covered in snow, but I could still make out the sharp metal blade poking up out of the drift. I had forgotten it. That blade might pry open the storm shutters. He could use it to break the car windows and dig out a storm shelter for himself. He could use it to smash my skull. He began to walk toward the house, his path taking him right past the shovel. As he came around the front of the car, a powerful gust of wind blew up from the west, driving a thick barrage of snowflakes right into his eyes. He threw his arm across his face to shield it and walked right past the shovel. It was so close to his feet that he nearly tripped over it, but he didn't look down and he didn't turn around. He hadn't seen it, and within minutes, it would be buried under the snow. I supposed that he might pick up a rock or a branch, break the car window, and try to dig out the snow with his bare hands. He might. But I knew when he passed that shovel that luck was on my side. He would most likely try again to get into the house, but he was weakened by cold, his brain addled. With his strength gone, he might even try persuasion, using that cloying, apologetic voice he sometimes used if he felt like he had gone too far the previous night. He would try to get in, but he would fail. I didn't know how far he would stagger in the other direction toward the Maggart farm. I didn't know if he would just grow tired and confused, lay down by the side of the road and slip into unconsciousness, or if he would fall prey to the strange urges of hypothermia, the feelings of being on fire that caused people to strip off their clothes and die naked in the snow. What I did know as I climbed under the covers, clutching the hot water bottle to my chest, is that they speak the truth when they say that revenge is a dish best served cold.